Lesson 26. Go ye into all the world and preach my gospel. Last week, when we started with a little bit of historical context. I'd like to do that again this week. Here is Alexander Hamilton, one of the founding fathers of the nation. He was really a mover and a shaker. I guess most of the founding fathers were movers and shakers, but Alexander Hamilton has kind of re-entered into our lexicon with the recent Broadway play and some of the other things that are going on. But he was an influential interpreter and promoter of the U.S. Constitution. He was the founder of the Federalist Party, the United States Coast Guard, the New York Post newspaper. He was the first Secretary of the Treasury, where he was actually a uh, big proponent of a national bank. And he wanted to have a federal bank for four main reasons. He wanted it to have the federal government assume the Revolutionary War debts of the several states. He wanted to use it to pay off those war debts. He wanted to use it to raise money for the new government, and he wanted to establish a national bank and create a common currency. At the time, the states had banks, other places had banks. You could start your own bank and print your own money. And most of the money had to be specie backed or backed by gold and silver. And so he wanted a common currency across all banks, similar to what we have today with the Federal Reserve note, where all the banks accept the Federal Reserve note as currency in the stores, and it's just one common currency. Thomas Jefferson was against this. He was more for the states' rights to have their have their own banks and things like that. But Alexander Hamilton won out, and the first Bank of the United States was established in 1791 to serve as a repository for federal funds and as the government's fiscal agent. It was granted a 20-year charter by Congress in spite of the opposition of Thomas Jefferson and his friends. While being based in Philadelphia, it had branches in 8 cities, and it conducted general commercial business as well as acting for the government. Now, this first Bank of the United States was actually very well run, very well managed, and was profitable. However, many entrepreneurs and state banks argued that its fiscal caution was constraining economic development, and many people were troubled by the fact that 2/3 of the bank stock was held by British interests. This is just not too far after the Revolutionary War. We still have kind of a chip on our shoulder towards them. A lot of people did not like the fact that 2/3 of the bank stock was held by British interests. So in 1811, when the charter came up for renewal, it was not renewed and the bank closed down. Now, the very next year was the War of 1812. Well, the War of 1812, if you talk to British historians, was kind of a footnote in the Grand Napoleonic Wars. For this young nation, the United States, it was a full-out war in its own right. And really, there was a bit of an issue there because with the war, we incurred war debts. So the War of 1812, even though it was just 1 year after the first U.S. bank charter was not renewed, started the conversation again about needing another bank. So in 1816, just a couple years later, the second Bank of the United States was established. It had functions much like the first. Also was given a 20-year charter by Congress. However, it was not as well run and as well managed, and many felt that its mismanagement helped bring on the Panic of 1819. Some of the states really tried to restrict what the bank could do in their state, but in a Supreme Court case in 1819, McCulloch versus Maryland, the Supreme Court held that the Constitution had granted Congress the implied power to create a central bank and that the states could not legitimately constrain that power. So there was a lot of friction there, and not only with the banks, but also with some entrepreneurs. Many Western entrepreneurs criticized the bank. They said it was an instrument of federal control and Eastern commercial interests. And so there's a lot of opinions about how effective the bank is, if we need the bank, what's going on. In 1832, Henry Clay uh, brings leads Congress to renew the bank charter, even though it wasn't due until 1836. And he did this because he was in cahoots with the bank president, Nicholas Biddle, and they were working together to help Clay run for Congress. And they thought that the bank would be a good platform that they could run off of, being proponents of the bank. Andrew Jackson, his first term was ending. He was somewhat ambivalent towards the bank, didn't like it, didn't dislike it, until he learned that Nicholas Biddle and Henry Clay, even the word cabal was used, were conspiring together to use the bank as a way to get Henry Clay elected and not let Andrew Jackson have a second term. That's where the quote comes from Andrew Jackson, as he's talking to his vice president, Martin Van Buren. He says, "The bank, Mr. Van Buren, is trying to kill me, but I will kill it." So Henry Clay gets the charter renewed in the Senate 4 years early. Hasn't even expired yet. They send it to Andrew Jackson. Henry Clay does not think Andrew Jackson will have the guts, I guess, the fortitude to squash that movement, but he does. And the letter that he writes, it was published in in a lot of the newspapers at the time, is well worth reading if you're interested in American history and revolutionary documents. This is a ways after the revolution, but very, very well written, well thought out letter that he writes to send it back to Congress. Here is the first paragraph of that. It says, this is quoting Andrew Jackson: "The bill to modify and continue the act entitled An Act to Incorporate the Subscribers to the Bank of the United States was presented to me on the 4th July instant. Having considered it with that solemn regard to the principles of the Constitution which the day was calculated to inspire, and come to the conclusion that it ought not to become a law, I herewith return it to the Senate, in which it originated, with my objections." Now, this caused quite a stir among those people who wanted the bank to remain, and became one of the primary issues of the 1832 campaign for president. Now, Jackson on one side and Clay and Biddle on the other personified the positions of each side, but the Jacksonians successfully concealed the incompatibility of their hard money and paper money factions in the anti-bank campaign, and that allowed Jackson to score an overwhelming victory, a landslide against Henry Clay. So Andrew Jackson wins the second term. As soon as he does, he immediately starts to close down the bank. While Congress was in recess, Jackson told his Treasury Secretary to move all the federal funds out of the U.S. bank to state banks. His secretary said, "No, I'm not sure you can do that. I'm not sure that's legal." Andrew Jackson says, "Okay, you're fired." He hires somebody else. They give him the same answer. He fires them. Hires a third, and they actually do that. So while Congress is on recess, Jackson has his third Treasury Secretary there transfer all the funds out to the state banks. Congress is incensed. They can't believe that he would do this. One of the few times in our nation's history when Congress censured a sitting president. They censored Andrew Jackson for doing what he did with the federal funds, but the deed was done. The bank was essentially dead, right? In an effort to promote sympathy for the institution's survival, Nicholas Biddle retaliated by contracting bank credit, inducing a serious and protracted financial downturn. So the bank is essentially dead. Biddle knows this. It's more a self-preservation thing he does here, and it really kind of blows back in his face. America's financial and business centers all gang up against him, and he has to reverse those policies. He does keep his job. He's able to convert the Bank of the U.S. to a state bank, whatever, and go on. But at any rate, the second bank of the U.S. was essentially closed. Now, at the same time, there was a lot of land speculation going on. There was a lot of land coming up for sale that had been taken from Native Americans. People were purchasing that land using paper money printed by state banks and other banks. And Jackson was concerned about this. So in 1836, the Specie Circular came out. It was a presidential executive order because the sale of public lands had increased 5 times between 1834 and 1836, just in those 2 years. And speculators were paying for these purchases with depreciating paper money. And Andrew Jackson was pretty concerned about that. He wanted it to, all payments for government land to be in gold and silver. Um, so even though that was already law, he now had a presidential executive order ensuring that people did that, and it was all over concern about the financial um, state in the United States. There was a lot of concern, and then in May of 1837, there was a financial collapse nationwide. The United States had a little over 800 banks at the time. All but 6 of them ceased to redeem their banknotes and deposits for specie. So what that means is back then everybody was printing their own notes, like we talked about, and you could at any time take that note to your bank. It was redeemable for gold or silver on demand. So you could go to the bank and you could say, here's that paper note back. I want the equivalent in gold or silver. And that was the gold standard, right? And that's the way it was supposed to work. But all but 6 of the banks ceased doing that because they had overextended themselves. They could not redeem their banknotes for specie. All but 6 of them did. May of 1837, huge financial collapse, which caused a 6-year depression. Okay, remember that. May 1837 is the beginning of a 6-year depression. Now, in the late 1830s, there was what was called a hard times token. It was privately minted, and it was used in place of a 1-cent coin during currency shortages. And it actually had a picture of Andrew Jackson on it with a sword and a bag of money climbing out of a strongbox. And around the perimeter it said, "I take the responsibility." People directly blamed that during this 6-year depression. This depression was bad. In the early 1840s, 6 states filed for bankruptcy. It had far-reaching and it was very impactful. And people placed the blame solely on Andrew Jackson. The majority of the people really thought that Andrew Jackson's policies had caused all of these hardships. And even today, many historians and economists will place primary blame for the Panic of 1837 on the policies of President Andrew Jackson. However, as time has gone on and history has become an academic pursuit instead of an art like it used to be, we are beginning to look at it differently. In the 1960s, economic historians had more sophisticated quantitative techniques, and they discovered that the primary factor causing monetary fluctuations during this period was the international specie flows orchestrated largely by the Bank of England. It was therefore the Bank of England, faced with declining reserves, that precipitated the panic by raising its discount rates in 1836. And in fact, the Second Bank of the U.S. had encouraged greater use of bank-issued notes and deposits as money rather than keeping a check on state banks. So if anything, Andrew Jackson's policies may have actually postponed an impending crisis. He was not to blame for it. He may have actually had created a couple more years of before the crisis hit. And then after 2008, when the financial crisis happened, then people started looking at 1837 somewhat with new eyes. A historian from the University of New Hampshire, Jessica M. Lepler, published a book about the Panic of 1837 and talks a lot about how the economic downturn was driven as much as by events in the United Kingdom as in the United States, and fueled by imperfect and delayed communications in an international market that relied heavily on credit. So it's pretty well understood now that Andrew Jackson's policies were not really the cause of the Panic of 1837 that started in May of 1837. So with that context and that background, what happened on March 27th, 1836, just a little more than a year before that financial collapse? Well, the Kirtland Temple was dedicated. In 1832, at the same time that the battle for the bank between Henry Clay and Andrew Jackson was going on, actually just after Andrew Jackson had won re-election in December, God commanded Joseph Smith to build a temple in Kirtland, Ohio. Construction began the following summer in June of 1833 at a time of great poverty in the church. And it slowed a little bit the next year because a lot of the brethren were absent with Zion's camp and whatever. But then it picked back up, and the prophet Joseph dedicated the Kirtland Temple on March 27th, 1836, just a year before the financial collapse hit. Now, a lot of the lessons so far this year have focused on Kirtland, because when you look at Kirtland, Uh, it was really, in my opinion, the pinnacle of the restoration, the early days of the church, right? And I'm not necessarily the only guy who feels that way. So from 1831 to 1838, Kirtland was headquarters for the Latter-day Saint movement. The first temple built in this dispensation was built there in Kirtland. Almost half of the 136 sections, revelations currently included in the Doctrine and Covenants, were recorded in Ohio. Now, some have suggested that between 1830 January and May of 1836, probably more Latter-day Saints had visions, prophesied, and spoke in tongues than at any other similar period in the history of the church. In one 15-week period, Latter-day Saints reported that during 10 different meetings, men of the priesthood beheld heavenly beings. During 8 of these meetings, many saw angels, and during 5, the Savior appeared to members worshiping in the temple. So Kirtland was just as close to heaven on earth as we've seen in recent history. It was very spiritual. It was amazing that the temple was there, and in fact, Daniel Tyler, a citizen of Kirtland at the time, said all felt that they had a foretaste of heaven. In fact, there were several weeks in which we were not tempted of the devil, and we wondered whether the millennium had commenced. At a meeting of priesthood brethren, the prophet Joseph addressed us. Among other things, he said, "Brethren, for some time Satan has not had power to tempt you. Some have thought that there would be no more temptation, but the opposite will come. And unless you draw near to the Lord, you will be overcome and apostatize." So the members in the saints there in Kirtland, a lot of them thought that the millennium had commenced. It was an amazing time to be alive, a very spiritual time to be alive. It was just unbelievable. And so, looking at Kirtland from a spiritual perspective, that's what we see. It's just this phenomenal experience for everybody involved, right? But thinking about Kirtland in the context of the economy at the time, right? Because the financial systems, the economy of the United States was in turmoil. Kirtland, while on the fringes of the United States, way out on the western frontier, was still very much a part of it. And so the Kirtland economy was pretty good during the construction of the temple. The temple, a lot of it was volunteer labor, but it had boosted the economy of Kirtland. However, after the dedication, the economy declined fairly rapidly as poor converts arrived in ever increasing numbers. Following the dedication of the Kirtland Temple, the church remained in debt for $13,000, and there was also about $6,000 deficit that had accumulated in Missouri. So $19,000 total. In 2017 dollars, that's almost $500,000 that the church is in debt for at this time. So the temple's been dedicated, right? Up until this point, a lot of branches of the church, everybody, even those not in Kirtland, all the saints had been sending money to Kirtland to help in the building of the Lord's house. Many people had given almost all their material wealth for the construction of the building. Instead of buying property for themselves when they came to Kirtland, they would settle on farms which had been bought by the leaders of the church and just build little, shanty cabins or whatever. And everybody was focused on spending the money to get the temple built. However, after the completion of the temple, the flow of money to Kirtland nearly ceased. It almost stopped. But the flow of people did not. And the Mormon population in Kirtland increased 20-fold, but their land holdings only quadrupled. So big problem there, right? All these people are coming to Kirtland, and while the temple is being built, money is being sent. But when the temple is done and the stories are going out of this amazing experience, people think that the millennium has come. People are still coming, most of them poor, most of them destitute, but they're coming. And they have testimonies. They're very spiritual. They're coming for a reason. But they're not coming with money to buy land. There's not really any land to be had because of the issues with, supply and demand. Prices are going up. It's not a great time. In fact, Joseph Smith wrote a letter that he sent out to most members of the church. There's a quote from that letter here where it says, It is very improper and unchristian-like, sending their poor from among them to this place without the necessary means of subsistence, whereas the church in this place being poor from the beginning, after deliberate discussion upon the subject, it was moved, seconded, and unanimously carried that we have borne our part of this burden, and that it becomes the duty henceforth of all the churches abroad to provide for those who are objects of charity, and not send them from their midst to burden the church in this place, unless they come and prepare a place for them and provide means for their support. That there be a stop put to churches or families gathering or moving to this place, as our houses are all full, and our lands mostly occupied, except those houses that do not belong to the church, which cannot be obtained without great sacrifice, especially when brethren with their families are crowding in upon us, and are compelled to purchase at any rate, and consequently are thrown into the hands of spectators and extortioners, with which course the Lord is not well pleased. Also that the churches abroad be required to do according to the revelation contained in the book of Doctrine and Covenants, commencing at section 101, 72, and 73, which is as follows. Now verily I say unto you, let all the churches gather together all their monies. Let these things be done in their time, be not in haste, and observe to have all things prepared before you. And let honorable men be appointed, even wise men, and send them to purchase these lands and all branches of the church in the eastern countries, when they are built up. If they will hearken unto this counsel, they may buy lands and gather together upon them, and in this way they may establish Zion. So that was a letter written by Joseph Smith that he sent out to the branches of the church and the members of the church, but also it weighed heavily on his mind, not just Joseph Smith's mind, but all the leaders of the church, seeing all of these people coming with nowhere to stay and no way to support them, and the church being really tight on cash. And in a meeting with the leadership of the church, Joseph Smith said, the saints have neglected the necessary preparation beforehand. The rich have generally stayed back and withheld their money, while the poor have gone first and without money. Under these circumstances, what could be expected but the appalling scene that now presents itself? Right? It was appalling. You could imagine a 20-fold increase in population, but only a 4-fold increase in land. And Joseph Smith said in the letter, there is no more space. Everybody who's got a farm, their farm is now covered with ramshack houses that were built in a rough, quick manner. And it was at this time that a gentleman by the name of Burgess comes into town, and he claims that he knows where there's a treasure. There's a large amount of money, according to him, hidden in an abandoned house in Salem, Massachusetts. According to him, an old widow has died, the house is vacant, and in her cellar her basement is a large sum of money. And he, Joseph, Hiram, the leaders of the church, they're in dire straits right now. They don't know what to do. They're grasping at straws, and so they believe Brother Burgess, and they go with him. Joseph Smith, Hiram Smith, Oliver Cowdery, Sidney Rigdon, they all traveled to Salem with Burgess in the hopes of finding this treasure, thinking that it might alleviate some of the financial burden of the church. So they get there in Salem. Burgess gets there, he looks around, and he says, the town has changed a little bit, a lot actually, and I don't recognize anything. I'm not sure which house it is. I don't know. And so they end up empty-handed without any treasure, but they do some preaching in the area. And section 111 in our current Doctrine and Covenants was given to the prophet in Salem, kind of in response to this trip, and opens by saying, I, the Lord your God, am not displeased with your coming this journey, notwithstanding your follies. I have much treasure in this city for you for the benefit of Zion, and many people in this city whom I will gather out in due time for the benefit of Zion. Through your instrumentality, concern not yourself about your debts, for I will give you power to pay them. Right? So God is, I don't know, maybe I'm reading into the tone here, but it seems kind of chuckling. He says, I'm not displeased with your coming on this journey, notwithstanding your follies, right? And then he goes on to say, I have much treasure in this city for you, right? Joseph and Hiram and Oliver and Sidney had gone to Salem looking for treasure, looking for gold, looking for money. That was their treasure. And God here, in kind of a gentle rebuke, is saying, I have much treasure in this city for you. But what's treasure to God? It's not gold. That's their asphalt. That's what they use to pave their roads with. The treasure is the people. And so Joseph and the others have some success in preaching there, and then um, they head back to Kirtland, and it's still, they're kind of going back empty-handed. They don't have a lot of money, and they didn't get the treasure they were hoping for, the gold, the monetary treasure they were hoping for. And so when they get back, they decide they're going to start a bank. So they get some legal assistance. Uh, they draw up an article of agreement and draft it to incorporate a bank in Kirtland, and they want to call it the Kirtland Safety Society, right? So in November of 1836, Joseph Smith sends Orson Hyde to the capital of Ohio with a petition to the legislature requesting that they approve the proposal to incorporate the bank. At the same time, he sends Oliver Cowdery to Philadelphia to purchase plates for printing currency. Remember, each bank is printing their own currency at this time. There's not a federal bank that's keeping everything, doing it all for everybody. So Orson Hyde goes to the capital of Ohio. Oliver Cowdery goes to Philadelphia. They both come back. Well, guess what? Oliver Cowdery has succeeded and purchased the plates for printing currency, but Orson Hyde was turned down. The legislature says no. Now look at the date here, November 1836, right? It's May of 1837 when the financial collapse happens. The financial markets, the economy in the U.S. is in turmoil right now, and the legislature is not dumb. They know that, and they're not going to approve a charter for another bank at a time like this. I don't think maybe it had something to do with the fact they were Mormons, but I really don't think so, given the climate, the financial problems that was the whole nation was struggling with at the time. So they're turned down. And so what do? Well, the brethren decide, well, we won't open a bank. We will create a private joint stock company to be called the Kirtland Safety Society Anti-Banking Company, right? They're still going to give this a shot. It's just not going to be an official bank. It'll be a company that acts like a bank. This wasn't unheard of. There was a few other joint stock companies in Ohio at the time who were operating similar to banks. So it's not like they come up with this on their own to skirt the law. There was precedent for it. And so the Kirtland Safety Society Anti-Banking Company opened for business January 2nd, 1837. Could you imagine a worse time to open a bank? I mean, maybe January of 2008, maybe, but I mean, it was the timing on this really wasn't that good. And they actually on the plates, Oliver Cowdery went to purchase plates, and he had the Kirtland Safety Society Bank on the printing plates, and they wrote in there anti-banking company. Because it wasn't actually a bank. So immediately the Kirtland Safety Society started having issues, as you would imagine any bank that opens in January of 1837 would have, given the climate, the financial climate at the time. And so one of the first things that happened is many other banks refused to accept the Safety Society's notes as legal tender. So at the time, all the banks printed their own notes, and the banks would agree to, accept other banks' notes. But the Safety Society's notes were not really well accepted. Not only that, the anti-Mormon newspapers immediately jumped on it and branded the currency as worthless, suggested that people stay away from it. Something that was going to potentially cause a huge problem is enemies of the church started buying up the banknotes, and they were gaining enough of them that they could have initiated a run on the bank. All they have to do, if they buy up enough of these banknotes and they walk in the bank and throw them on the counter and say, I want to redeem these for gold. Most of the Kirtland Safety Society's assets were held in the form of land in Kirtland, not in specie. And so the bank officers knew that there was a pretty big issue here, and they actually had to suspend payment in specie to customers a few weeks after the first notes were even issued, right? Which, when you think about the timing, isn't much different from what almost all the other banks in the United States had to do around the same time. But a lack of a charter hindered the company's credibility. Even though there were a couple others who were operating like that, it still was a serious issue. Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon were charged with violating the banking statutes of Ohio and brought to trial. They eventually stepped down, but that didn't really help. And the anti-banking company closed its doors less than a year later in November of 1837. Right. So May 1837 is when the nationwide financial collapse starts that precipitates a 6-year depression. So bad timing to start a bank, right? But remember, almost everybody was blaming Andrew Jackson nationwide, blaming Andrew Jackson and his policies for what was going on in the financial system of the United States. Well, Joseph Smith was the same way. A lot of people, many people, were blaming the failure of the Kirtland Safety Society anti-banking company squarely on Joseph Smith, which had a huge impact on what was going on at Kirtland. There was a lot of apostasy. In August of 1837, Joseph Smith and most of the Quorum of 12 were away on missions. Warren Parrish, who used to be Joseph Smith's scribe, that quote we read from the letter just a few minutes ago, that was Warren Parrish worked as the scribe. And Warren Parrish was also an officer in the Kirtland Safety Society. Him and John Boynton, a member of the 12, led a group armed with pistols and Bowie knives in an attempt to take over the temple. I mean, you can imagine, like an Indiana Jones kind of thing. You got these guys with pistols and Bowie knives storming into the temple, and you got saints literally jumping out of the windows. It's just mass chaos. Nobody knows what's going on. The police were eventually able to come in and straighten everything out, but it was chaos. It was a disaster. And when Joseph Smith and most of the quorum came back, they disfellowshipped those who took part in that. But just like, similar to what we read in the Book of Mormon, anybody who showed sincere contrition for their actions were immediately reinstated. They were welcomed back into the fold. However, not but a few months later that fall, Joseph Smith, Sidney Rigdon again were gone. They left for Missouri. Troubles flared up again when Warren Parrish, John Boynton, the same guys who tried to take the temple, with other 30 or so other leading citizens, they organized a group they called the Old Standard, or the Church of Christ. They considered themselves reformers of the Restoration. They were insisting that Joseph Smith was a fallen prophet who, with other church authorities, had departed from the true faith. They again sought to overthrow the church, again sought to take over the temple. They still taught most of the church's doctrines, but rejected Joseph Smith, his authority, and they rejected the Book of Mormon, which was interesting because at the time Martin Harris was in a state of apostasy, but he stood up to them and he said, I am a witness of that book. It is true, and anyone who rejects it will be damned. So even though Martin Harris was in a state of apostasy, he still stood up to those guys and bore testimony of the Book of Mormon. So 50 leading members of the church were excommunicated directly under the direction of Joseph Smith. Carolyn Barnes Crosby noted, she was a citizen of Kirtland, she noted, many of our most intimate associates were among the apostates. These were some of our nighest neighbors and friends. We had taken sweet counsel together and walked to the house of God as friends. And now, it's not like that. Several apostates tormented the faithful members with lawsuits, threatening loss of property. Anti-Mormons would boycott, ostracize. They wouldn't employ people who were true to the faith. It was quite the time, and it wasn't just Kirtland. Between November 1837 and June 1838, possibly 200 or 300 Kirtland saints withdrew from the church, representing about 10 to 15% of the membership there. So that's a significant amount. If you think about the wards, the stakes, even the church, 10 to 15% walking away. That would have quite an impact on those that are left, right? Watching all of these people leave. And it carried over into Missouri as well. In a 9-month period, the 3 witnesses, a member of the First Presidency, 4 members of the 12 Apostles, and several members of the First Quorum of the 70 left the church. There were times where Joseph Smith had to flee for his life. One time he had to leave Kirtland in a rush, couldn't even tell Emma goodbye because he was led on to an assassination plot that was about to take place. It was a bad time, right? It was a really bad time. And Kirtland had just hit its pinnacle, is the pinnacle of the restoration, where people thought the millennium had come, and now it just cratered. It went down lower than maybe it had ever been. And it's quite the dichotomy between where it was and where it is now in a very short period of time, actually. And about 130 years later, Boyd K. Packer was talking in BYU, and he talks about this time. He says, "You remember at the time of Kirtland when the prophet Joseph Smith was beleaguered on every side. He was harassed by those who should have supported him. In an incredible move, he called around him those who were secure to him and whom he trusted and those who might have given him some protection and sent them away on missions to foreign lands. It was a move that certainly was not reasonable, and yet as the pages of history unfolded and the apostates had their day and left the church, hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands of converts came forth to fill the ranks that had been abandoned by those who would not listen to the voice of the prophet." Right? So what did Joseph do at this time when everything's falling apart? He takes his most trusted friends and colleagues and he sends them on foreign missions. These are the first international missionaries, not counting Canada, the first to go overseas, go on a mission. And Heber C. Kimball was one of the ones to lead the missionaries who went to England. Now, Joseph Smith later is quoted as saying that out of the 12 apostles called in Kirtland, only 2 remained faithful and never, I forget, as Joseph puts it, like kicks them with their heel or something like that. Heber C. Kimball and Brigham Young. They were the only 2 apostles from Kirtland who remained faithful throughout this entire time. And Joseph Smith pulls Heber C. Kimball aside one day in the temple and says, "I'm going to send you on a mission to England," or the Lord wants you to go on a mission to England for the salvation of the church. Now, Heber Kimball was pretty concerned. I mean, he felt inadequate when he was called as an apostle, and now he's being called to go on a mission. And, one of the first things he says is, "I am a man of stammering tongue," right? And think about this. You're Heber C. Kimball. You are there with the prophet Joseph, and you are watching everything crumble around you. The Kirtland Safety Society has failed. Most of the leadership has either jumped ship or been excommunicated. You're watching, you watched all of these saints coming into Kirtland. You watched the population grow by 20-fold, and now you're watching people leave, right? And you're being called on a mission. You're being sent on a mission. How can you preach the restoration when the restoration is falling apart, right? But he is so excited that when he goes to England, as the ship starts pulling up to the dock, he jumps off. He doesn't even wait for the lines to be thrown and for the ship to be tied up. He jumps off onto the dock and he is ready to go. Gordon B. Hinckley said of this, he said, "The opening of the British mission in 1837 was a declaration of a millennial vision. The resurrected Lord had said to his beloved disciples, 'Go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature.'" Right, that's the title of this lesson. Go ye into all the world and preach the gospel. Here we have Heber C. Kimball, one of the few, one of only a couple apostles remaining faithful, and he's going. He actually had some other members of the 12 encourage him not to go and to say that we will not support you. But he went anyways. And he had phenomenal success. So Heber C. Kimball went on 2 missions to England, and I would highly encourage anybody to read of the experiences on his first mission. Him, Joseph Fielding, Orson Hyde. Orson Hyde was actually, everybody thought he had disaffected from the church, but when he heard that Heber C. Kimball had been called on a mission, he showed up and he fell to his knees and he said, I'm sorry, can I please go with, I want to go with him. And so he went. Joseph Fielding had I think it was an uncle in Britain who was a pastor. And when they got there, he let them use his church to preach. And yeah, that only lasted for about a week and a half. And then he said, you got to stop doing that, right? Because they were having too much success. How much success did they have? Well, they baptized between 7,000 and 8,000 converts and established many congregations. They published 5,000 copies of the Book of Mormon, as well as thousands of hymnals, tracts, and copies of the Millennial Star, which was their newspaper. Directly through their ministry, 1,000 new members immigrated to America, right? So we have a couple hundred people leaving Kirtland. We have 1,000 coming to backfill them. So my question is, why? Why were they so successful? How could they be so successful? Knowing what was happening back home, knowing that, armed mobs were trying to take over the temple, that people were apostatizing, that Joseph Smith had to flee in the middle of the night, couldn't even tell Emma goodbye for his life. Maybe Joseph Smith has already been killed. Like, how do they know? How can they be so excited? How can they go out there and have such amazing success, knowing that the very structure of what they're talking about is crumbling back home? Well, Neal A. Maxwell said in General Conference in 1975, he said, the man of Christ need not always be fully articulate, which, remember, Heber C. Kimball said he's of stammering tongue, for real Christianity is contagious, right? That's the beauty here. Heber C. Kimball, Joseph Fielding, Orson Hyde, the missionaries over there, they weren't caught up in the noise, right? The noise of the Kirtland Safety Society, of everything else that was going on, the immediate things that were happening at that specific moment in time. They were caught up in the gospel. They were caught up in the restoration of the gospel, and that was what was burning inside of them. That is why Heber C. Kimball was so excited that he jumped off the boat onto the dock before it even tied up. That is why they saw so much success, because they had that fire burning inside of them. They knew what it was. And I really like this word contagious that Neal A. Maxwell uses. Real Christianity is contagious, because when we talk about contagious, I think about contagious. If I'm sick and I'm contagious, I don't really need to do much to infect you. I just have to get close enough, right? And that's all it takes. I don't really have to say much. I don't have to do much. I don't have to convince you of anything. If I'm contagious, just being around me, you're going to get it, right? When I was on my mission, ran into a guy once, was talking to him on the street, and he said, well, I'll go to your church if you come to mine. And I said, done, deal, you got it. Where do you meet? When are your meetings? And he was a member of a small church that had just started, had less than 20 people in it. They met in a small elementary school. And when I attended, it was called Fox Hollow Community Church. When I went there that Sunday to meet with them, they were in the middle of a 6-week workshop, which was based on a book that had recently been published called Becoming a Contagious Christian. And so it was great. We met with them, in like I said, a very small group, and they were talking about how can we grow our church. And their focus wasn't on, finding other Christians. Their focus was on finding people who weren't Christians or who had lost their faith, and how they could become contagious Christians. And that's what Neal A. Maxwell was saying. Real Christianity is contagious. That's what Heber C. Kimball and his missionary companions had. They had that contagious form of Christianity. They had the burning inside of them of the restoration, regardless of all the noise and all the minutia of the immediate time that was affecting a lot of areas of the United States, not just the saints. So when I think about becoming a contagious Christian, when I think about missionary work, I think about a checklist, right? I think Mormons a lot of times they feel like they have a checklist of things that they need to do. We need to read our scriptures, say our prayers, pay our tithing, do our home teaching or visiting teaching, make sure we do our calling, have family home evening every Monday, go to the temple once a month, attend all our meetings, keep a journal, do our food. I mean, you could just go on and on and on and on and on, right? We have this big long list of things that we have to do that takes time. It takes time to read our scriptures. It takes time to do our home teaching, our visiting teaching. It takes time to do our calling. We have to set aside time Monday nights to do family home evening. It takes time to do all of this stuff. And we put missionary work on that checklist. It's something that we have to schedule in, something that we have to check off, right? Well, I would suggest that missionary work does not belong on that checklist, right? Missionary work is not something that you have to have time to do. Missionary work is something that happens as you do the rest of those things. It's something that happens as you become a true Christian. In September of 1990, Ezra Taft Benson, in the first presidency message of the Ensign, wrote about keys to successful member missionary work. And the first thing he said is you have to strive to obtain the Spirit. You can't do missionary work if you don't have the Spirit. First thing you got to do is focus on getting the Spirit. The second thing he said was you have to acquire humility. Without humility, you're not going to make it very far in that line of work. Third thing he said is you have to love the people. So, as we talked about a couple weeks ago, most of these lessons boil down to love and charity. That's what the gospel is all about. That's what this is all about. It's loving people. That's what missionary work is all about. Loving people, being humble and loving people. Striving to obtain the Spirit. That's also what the lessons this year are about, is having revelation, personal revelation in your own lives, right? So we got to strive to obtain the Spirit. We have to be humble. We have to love everybody. And then fourth, he says, work diligently. Now, I would imagine most people, when they see that work diligently, they're probably thinking about missionary work, right? Like going out, knocking on doors, speaking to complete strangers, things like that. But the first thing Ezra Taft Benson says after he says work diligently, he says, if we want to keep the Spirit, we must work at it, right? We must work to keep the Spirit with us. We must work at loving others. We must work at being humble. You do those three things, the missionary work kind of just comes. In that book and that workshop, Becoming a Contagious Christian, they talk about one of the best ways to do missionary work is to understand your own style. Some people may like talking to strangers. Some people may be, people person, and they like doing that. Other people maybe not so much. You have to understand your own style. If you have the Spirit with you, if you have the fire of Christ burning inside of you, then you will become contagious, and you don't have to, do your missionary work in a way that you think fits inside the box that we have labeled missionary work. You can do it in whatever way fits your style, and you can be yourself while doing it. So in closing, I've got just a couple of scriptures. One from the Doctrine and Covenants. Section 115 came from right around this time. It was given to the prophet when he was in Missouri in April of 1838. So, right after, just a few months after the bank had collapsed, missionaries have been sent out. I mean, things are not in the best place right now. And the Lord says, verily I say unto you all, arise and shine forth, that thy light may be a standard for the nations, and that the gathering together upon the land of Zion and upon her stakes may be for a defense and for a refuge from the storm and from wrath when it shall be poured out without mixture upon the whole earth. Refuge from the storm. I mean, these guys were going through a storm right now, right? And then one from Romans 10:14. And how can they believe in him if they have never heard about him? And how can they hear about him unless someone tells them? Unless you tell them, right? Missionary work is all about your own conversion and converting yourself and having a fire inside of you to where you are contagious. You're contagious. Just being around people, they catch the bug. And then finally, the church has put out this Preach My Gospel, a book that the missionaries use to study the gospel and learn great resource for anybody else who's thinking about missionary work or wants to kindle that fire inside of them. Highly recommend you pick it up, have a look. Thank you.